Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, it's quite hard for a lot of us to work out exactly how bad things really are in the NHS underneath the headlines and so forth. 4 years ago, Sir Robert Francis' inquiry into the Mid-Staffordshire hospital scandal found evidence of appalling suffering by patients and a failure at every level. Never again was the response, but this winter pressures on the NHS in England have reached a point where ministers concede it's unacceptable. So could a similar crisis recur? Sir Robert joins me now from Southampton. Welcome, Sir Robert.
Good morning.
You've talked about the NHS being at a great level of stress. How bad are things in your view?
Well, I think they are pretty bad. We've got a virtual storm of financial pressures, increased demand, difficulties finding staffing, and pressure on the service to continue delivering. And some of that sounds quite familiar, and as it was, those were the conditions pertaining at the time of Mid-Staffordshire. Things have changed since then, so the very fact that we're talking about this today in the way that we are, the very fact that the Secretary of State says things are unacceptable, shows that there's a greater level of transparency. So people are talking excuse me, about the problems in a way that they weren't before. But the system is running extremely hot at the moment, and it's only working at all because of the almost superhuman efforts of the staff of the NHS. And it can't carry on like that indefinitely without something going or risking going badly wrong.
Now, to remind people, the Mid-Staffs scandal was utterly horrific. People lying in their own faeces, hundreds of people potentially dying earlier than they might have done. Awful, awful tales of kind of cruelty and neglect. When you say that we might see another Mid-Staffs, isn't that overdoing it a bit?
Well, I think, as I say, that there are better safeguards in place in terms of transparency, the greater inspection. So I would like to think that before we got to that stage, that the problems would come to light. But I think the risks increase all the time, that the pressure keeps on getting worse. And that we know that more and more chief executives are saying they can't meet their financial targets. More and more hospitals haven't got staff that they plan to have, and things are being done about all these things, but the faster the engine has to run, the more effort that has to be made in repairing it, the greater the risks.
We seem to be stuck in a kind of spiral with these stories, which is the government says we're putting in enough money, and then there's another scandal and another crisis, and we go round and round and round. Do you think we are now at the point as a country where we need to think about a different way of funding the NHS, a more consistent way of looking at the funding of the NHS so we don't have ththese recurring crises?
Well, I don't think the problems are entirely due to money. Money can provide a sort of sticking plaster, and the history of the NHS has been that over a number of years, whenever there's a crisis, more money is put in. But we carry on doing things in the same way. Excuse me, I need to put my thing back on.
Sorry about this.
But
BBC technology.
We also need to completely revisit how we actually deliver the service. And so for instance, adult social care is also in a state of crisis. And if we don't change the way we do things, if we, for instance, don't find better ways of avoiding people having to come to hospital, we're going to carry on repeating these crises.
Now, I'm sorry about your earpiece. I know how irritating that can be.
Yeah.
But since I've got you here, can I ask you about the condition of whistleblowers? Because a lot of whistleblowers feel that in your reports you didn't give them enough safeguards against, frankly, bullying bosses who didn't want their stories to come out. And the rest of us kind of depend upon whistleblowers to tell us sometimes what's going on inside the NHS.
Yeah. Well, I've made proposals, the intention of which is to make the raising of concerns utterly normal and welcome within the service, and those reforms I think are getting more embedded. So for instance, we now have a network of freedom to speak up guardians around almost all hospitals. They all should have one by now, to whom people can go when they have a problem about raising concerns. There's a national guardian to ensure that the network gets the support that it needs. But you know, the problems are not going to be solved simply by helping, although important as it is, individual whistleblowers. We need to make sure that the staff who currently say that things are going wrong are listened to, and because they have the solutions often to the problems that are met on a day-to-day basis. And I do believe that that is absolutely necessary.
Very interesting. Sir Robert, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
I've been getting away with it all